Thank you all for coming today. It's great to have you all here. I'm really looking forward to the walkthrough and the workshop. So I'm going to start over here by talking about my earliest work. This is 27 years of my career working in ceramics. A quick background is I started in painting in the late 60s at what is now Cal State Northridge. And my sophomore year of college, I took a ceramics class. And the moment my hands touched the clay, it spoke to me. How many people here can say that about a medium? Absolutely. Yeah. So that changed my direction. And so I'm going to walk you through things that inspire me. If you have any questions, like Zach, I'm going to put him out there. He came to my walkthrough earlier in the month and he asked an outstanding question of appropriation of design. So we can talk about that maybe more in detail if you're interested in some of these, themes. And we could talk during the workshop, but please ask questions as we walk around, because it's best that I'm in front of the piece and I can address what you want to know from me. So I'm going to start over here. This is column number 6, Italian. I was very fortunate my junior year of college to study in Florence, Italy. And Italy has been in my heart ever since. And you can see that things have outgrown from the time spent there in the early 70s. And so I went back again, like over 20 years later, as a designer in a ceramics factory in De Ruta, Italy, doing maiolica ware, which is terracotta clay dipped in white glaze to emulate porcelain, because at the time during the Renaissance, there was no porcelain in Europe. It was sought after, and there's a great book by Edmund de Wald, if any of you are interested, called The White Road, that talks about the history of porcelain. I've read it twice. It's really fascinating. So while living in Italy, I learned all about ceramics, our history and architecture. And so this piece here blends patterns from all these different areas into a still life. I started out as a thrower, a vessel maker in college. I still am a vessel maker. And I go between throwing on the wheel and hand building. And I also love color and pattern, and you can see that through my work. I'll briefly talk about this piece, Arts and Crafts Still Life number 2. The first one was a commission from my sister who collects arts and crafts style furniture. And so I created a piece for her, and then I decided to do this one here. It's funny because these pots on there look like replications of Rookwood pottery, if any of you know the history of ceramics in this country. And I've had movie studios contact me and ask me, oh, can you make some of these pots for a shoot? And then they want to pay me nothing, and I say, I can't do that, So anyway, that's this piece. And so what's interesting about my introduction to ceramics in Italy is if you go back further in history, during the Renaissance, the Italian ceramics industry was greatly influenced by the Islamic world. Trade that came from the East with Turkey and Iran, and then the group of Arabs that came from the region which is today Iraq, Iran, came up through Africa into southern Spain, and they brought with them, of course, a group of craftspeople were among them, and they brought with them techniques, forms, and patterning, and created their wares, and then it was disseminated through Europe, firstly to Italy. Now, whether it came from the island of Majorca, it was sent out from southern Spain through Majorca, or whether it has to do with the Spanish name for luster, the techniques that they used that I just discussed of the terracotta clay dipped in a white glaze after it's bisque and painted directly on the glaze before it's fired to emulate porcelain, that white of porcelain that Western Europe coveted and wanted. And so this, it's called maiolica in Italy because of either the name of the luster or the island of Majorca. It's called faience in France because in Italy, the great centers of Italian Maiolica were De Ruta, where I worked, Gubbio, Faenza, and faience takes the name from Faenza. It's also called Maiolica in Germany, and it is called Delftware in England and the Netherlands. And it's not to be confused with Majolica. Majolica is a completely different ceramic technique in which the use of lead transparent glazes are used. It was started by Bernard Palissy in France, and in England, Mintonware, that takes its techniques from Palissy's work, not from the genuine Maiolica of southern Spain through Italy. If there was not an Islamic world, there would never have been a Renaissance in Western Europe. And I want all of you to know that because there's so much negative news about that part of the world today that it really, part of my work is to disseminate this positive light on the culture from the Islamic world and how it really has impacted us in such a positive way. So I'm going to move over here to talk about the next few pieces. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Yes?
Did you use underglaze for the coloring?
That's a very good question. On this piece, I used underglaze. This is an underglaze. How I can tell is it's very matte and it doesn't have a lot of transparency. This is underglaze back here. This is underglaze. And then there's glaze. This, you can tell this is glaze because there's many colors in the surface. This is glaze here because it is translucent and you can see the texture that the glaze has bled into, making it a darker value, but the same color.
Something else too very quickly. So many of my students are having their sort of first introduction of falling in love with ceramics like you talked about, and most of them via pottery and functional pottery. And so there's something very intriguing going on in the studio where there are lots of references to functionality, but nothing is functional. Nothing is used for that intended purpose of function. It's more conceptual in its idea. So I'm hoping that some of my students will have questions regarding that. Why are you using forms, pottery forms, made for use in an entirely different context or a different way? So it would be really nice to hear about those ideas, your intent, and why you use functional forms to communicate very deep political, spiritual, ethical, philosophical ideas.
That is a great question. And can you remember that for the workshop? Because
yes,
if I start talking that, then we're not going to move from here. But that is a good question, and I love the vessel form. Even though in American society it makes your work kind of related to craft, and that's a bad word. But I still love the vessel form. It's the history and everything that goes with it. So let's move over here. I'm going to move in front of this work right here, and I guess what I did is I did skip over the two pieces I was supposed to talk about that I introduced the Islamic world. One is globalization, number 3 here, that everyone seems to hover around and love because it has Pokemon characters. Yeah. So it kind of gets your attention that way. You're drawn to it, you look at it. It's of Turkish influence. The shape is a ewer. And what I wanted to do with that, I call this series Globalization. And globalization deals with the idea of these Pokemon characters. The reason why I labeled it that is in the middle of the Pokemon craze, which was in the 90s, the Pokemon was known across the world, everywhere in the world. It started in Japan, and it means pocket monster. And so what I wanted to do was to take high-end decorative art and insert something about popular culture into it. So that series comes out of that idea. And then back here, This piece here that has multiple sections and small little necks all over it is called Muhammad's Line. And Muhammad's Line takes its name because during the Renaissance, the Italian Maiolica painters used a lot of blue to outline their patterns. They outlined them first and then filled in the color. And the blue, which is cobalt, came from Persia. And so to them, it was the land of Muhammad. So in great respect, I named the piece Muhammad's Line. And that itself is a tulipiary. It holds tulips that have fragile stems. So each tulip would go into one of those necks that would hold it up. And I was giving a lecture in Azerbaijan, and I was talking about this piece, and a woman in the audience got up and she was so upset. You know, I didn't understand what she was saying, but the translator said, oh, she's very upset that you used Muhammad's name in this manner. And I just really felt terrible, but you know, my purpose was a positive one. So it was kind of awful because everyone told her to shut up and sit down. But anyway, I thought she had a good point, and I understood why she was so upset. This piece here was created after my second visit to Azerbaijan. I was invited by the American ambassador to Azerbaijan to come through the Department of State as an art ambassador. And if you don't know where Azerbaijan is, because most people do not know where it is on the Caspian Sea, right north of Iran. It is east of Armenia and Turkey. It is south of Chechnya and Russia. And then to the east is the Caspian Sea and all the stands. And so it's a country that has been put on the map because it's rich in oil. And so they took me when I was there. On my first visit, I met with artists, I went to school and met with students and lectured to them. I did a master class, I did all kinds of wonderful programming and met wonderful people. And then I went back on a grant from the University of Southern California, where at the time I was on faculty. And I went back to a site called Shaki, which is a couple hours northwest of Baku, which is right on the Caspian Sea. Baku's right on the Caspian Sea. And it was kind of nestled in the base of the Caucasus Mountains. All this sounds so exotic. It was so exciting to go there. And I loved this summer palace, the Khan Summer Palace in Shaki, because it was floor to ceiling, tiny miniature paintings like you find in Persia, the history of Persia. And so I went there for a second time and walked through it slowly, took a lot of images, and I noticed this shape kept turning up time and again. And you'll see this shape in my artwork. I love it so much, I've made a tattoo on my wrist here about it. And so this shape originally comes from India. It's a mango shape, but we know it as a paisley. It's a paisley because in the textile industry of the United Kingdom and Scotland, their mills were in a town called Paisley. So that's how it got its name. And it was really popular in the 1960s. But in Azerbaijan, this shape is called a buta. And the buta is the symbol of life, or the life cycle. And I was just so intrigued with this idea that shape is the life cycle. And they explained to me that it's the shape of the life cycle because it's the shape of a fetus in the womb. It's the shape of a flower about to bud and bloom. It's the shape of a single cell. It's the shape of the brain. So it has many more connections to life and death, but I loved that idea so much that I decided to make this mandala piece, which I call Life Cycle Number 1. Yes?
It's kind of like a yin-yang also.
It is,
colors and
yes.
shapes. So is that another message that you're...
Yeah, it's another message, I think, in it too, that people can get out of it. Mandala, yin-yang, these individual elements with their own messages, kind of multi-layered.
How long did it take you to do this piece?
I made 2 of them. I probably worked on them for about 3 months.
Question was right?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so I also like working on a lot of kind of bigger concepts such as life and death, and I was just wondering if the color scheme you use tied into that anyway, because I find it's hard to find color schemes that work with something like that.
No, the color scheme is my own, something that I thought would attract people to it. But that's a really good question, you know. Because in the West, you know, mourning, we all in the West wear black. You go into Asia, you wear white. It's kind of interesting. Everybody has, and maybe there are other cultures that have different colors for significance for.
The color was important because you chose.
Right.
Maybe unconsciously, complementary contrasting colors.
Right.
That's curious. So then, was there some intent, or was it just purely visual?
It was visual. I mean, I taught color theory for a number of years at UCLA, so I'm very aware of colors and what they do to each other and how they appear. And I'm going to move over to the piece here that names the show. Susanna came up with the brilliant idea to call the show Cultural Diplomacy. So this is the centerpiece of the show because of all my travels and working with different cultures. And so this is a griffin, and a griffin is a bird head and an animal body. And it is a rhyton. And what a rhyton is, it's an ancient name for a drinking vessel. And so I saw this piece initially in the LA Times, the original rhyton. The Griffin. I call him Mr. Griffin familiarly. But anyway, I saw this lovely piece being held by a gentleman. It was very small, made of bronze. And it happened to have a wonderful story behind it. So in 2003, the original piece is a 7th century Persian antiquity. And it was brought illegally into the United States by an antiquity dealer who thought he would sell it, make a lot of money. But the United States government confiscated it when he entered the country. And they put it in a depository with all other wonderful things that they take. And it sat there for 10 years. And then when the new president of Iran was elected, Rouhani, in 2013, he came to the United States with a delegation to address the United Nations. And so someone in the State Department had a brilliant idea, let's return this antiquity to this delegation. And maybe we can get some communication going with the Iranians, because at the time, everyone in the news was talking about their nuclear program, and were they close to nuclear weapons and, you know, all this stuff. So they returned the original object to the delegation, and the next day Obama and Rouhani had a phone conversation, and right after that, they sat down and started talking about Iran's nuclear program. And it just blew me away that a small artifact, a small piece of art, had so much power to bring people together to talk about issues of today. So I decided to make my own rhyton, my own griffin. He's much larger than the original. He's not bronze, he's ceramic. And this finishes because it is soda fired. And you know, each piece I make a decision on the theme of how I'm going to finish it. And how it came out was totally random, because the slip that I used in the soda kiln was one that went anywhere from a mustard to from this dark, almost metallic gray to mustard to turquoise. And so what I decided to fill my rhyton with wasn't something to drink out of, but to fill it with the natural found ingredients for making nuclear weapons. So in the back here, we have uranium ore, then we have yellow cake, and then we have plutonium. And a friend of mine works at the State Department, who's a friend of Arts and Embassies, and I made this in 2015, so I wrote her, I go, I'm making yellow cake in my studio, and I just wanted to see if the government would come over and do anything, but they didn't. But anyway, these are all ceramic materials. The yellow cake is yellow underglaze. I went online and researched everything and looked at visuals, so that's how I tried to replicate them. And then I took the underglaze, dried it out, used a mortar and pestle to ground it into a fine powder, and then I fired it. So that's the story of cultural diplomacy. I'm going to move over here and talk about when you entered, and we'll go back and look at that in a bit. You saw the big piece with all the butas around it, and this one here, which the big piece with the butas around it is called Nino Has Laughing Eyes, and it comes from a passage of a book that's very famous in Azerbaijan, written in the 30s. The writer is kind of a mystery. His pen name is Kurban Said, but it gives a wonderful story of, it's a love story between Nino and Ali Khan. Ali Khan is Muslim and Nino is Armenian, so she's Orthodox Christian. And they have this wonderful love between them. And there's nothing, you know, the families aren't negative about it. It's just at that time of the 20s, you know, actually the book takes place at the outbreak of the First World War. You know, it was a very cosmopolitan city. You know, they welcomed Jews from the pogroms out of Eastern Europe. So it was a pretty open culture. So I created a series that to me references the wonderful architecture, patterning, and colors that I saw in Azerbaijan, kind of intermingled with things from my native Los Angeles. I'm a native Angeleno. So here you kind of get a feeling, these are supposed to be like architectural openings by inserting the pot into this box in a negative way. And then the passages inside come from Ali and Nino. In Baku, there is the Shirvan Shah's Palace, which is an amazing complex of buildings that have very complex carvings, detailed carvings of designs, and they're all carved out of limestone, so they're gray. So I decided in making my piece that I would reference the terracotta clay that's native to my California. So I have other pieces in this series also, but that explains this and the one in the entry. These carpets, when I went to Azerbaijan the first time in 2006, because I did go back again in 2008 on a grant, as I said, from USC, I went with the mind of finding a weaver. I wanted to do some carpet. So even though my focus is ceramics, I'm not opposed to working in other media if it answers the theme of my work better than working in clay. So I was in Azerbaijan, and one of the places that they took me to as an art ambassador was the Romani settlement. And the Romani settlement is where people with physical challenges live, because you can't live in Baku. Maybe they have flooding, I don't know, their sidewalks are really high off the street. There's no elevators in buildings unless they're a new building. So if you can't walk, and this weaver, Abalova Kanira, is wheelchair bound, she just couldn't maneuver living in Baku or the countryside where she was from. So she was living in the Romani settlement, and they brought me there because there were a number of artists that were working there. And when I met her, she was very generous. She gave me a small carpet that she wove that says Allah is great. And I really love that carpet. I have it in my studio. And I looked at it and I said, oh my goodness, she's so talented. And then I took aside the translator and I said, ask her if she will weave some carpets for me. And she agreed. So when I came back to the States, through Naili, who is my translator and someone that had email, I sent Naili directions. I mailed watercolors to Azerbaijan for Abalova to use as the design for the carpets. She took the watercolors, and on a piece of paper that was graph paper with tiny, tiny squares in it, each square was colored, and each square is a color and a knot in these carpets here. This carpet here is called Abalova's Journey, and I called it that because when I received it, it was the first carpet she wove and she sent to me. There were some things in it that weren't in my design. So the first thing I saw was up here in the corner, this tiny flag of Azerbaijan. Then I looked at it more and I saw QA, her initials. And then next to them was a little bird. And I go, what the? So I was really upset. And so I wrote an email to Naili and I said, can you please ask Abalova what these elements are that she added to my design? You know, I wasn't accusatory. I decided, you know, the best way to bridge this was to just ask a question. And I was so glad I did, because the answer came back that Abalova is so proud of her country, Azerbaijan, she added the flag. She wove this carpet, she made this carpet, so she put her initials on it. And her dream was to come to America. So she made this little swallow here, and this is Abalova's swallow. And she hoped to follow the swallow to America one day. I did look into bringing her through different agencies that could help her as a disabled person to come here, because when you change planes in Frankfurt, or most planes that go to Azerbaijan go through Germany, I mean, you have to walk downstairs. You're not on a bridgeway or anything, but I was unable to bring her here. But she's still weaving. She received an award from the president of Azerbaijan for her talents. And she has been teaching young women with disabilities to learn how to weave, because she feels that she can teach them to feel value in their life. She's an amazing person. So I made this carpet here. The one next to it is called Tears for the Black Garden, Nagorno-Karabakh. And that's the name because there's a conflict that's going on at this moment in Azerbaijan that's been going on since the fall. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, when it was liberated from Soviet rule, and the Armenians and the Azeris started killing each other.
No, I had a question in regards to the first piece earlier.
Yes.
But more so in regards to history. You were saying that it was Arabs that came from Iraq and Iran that went up into Spain.
Yes.
In regards to like sparking the Renaissance. And in Islamic history, it's taught about the Moors.
The Moors, they are Moors, you were right,
So
that's their name.
Okay.
You are correct.
Okay, because I was...
Because they're of Arabic origin, aren't they, the Moors?
In Islamic history, during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Moors, or an Arab, was a person that was known as an Arab by their tongue. So the Arab that you see today is more like a descendant of like the Slavic slaves once Islam began to spread out of the Arabian Peninsula. But the Moors were from Northern Africa, from Morocco, because it's a short area to cross.
And they went over to
Europe.
Spain.
And they went into Spain and France and even Rome. But I was just...
You were right, I didn't use the word more, and that is correct. And the interesting thing is the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims lived in peace from the 9th to the 14th century when Queen Isabella came into power, and everyone had to convert to Catholicism or leave Spain or be killed. So if you go into southern Spain, where I haven't been, I've only seen photos, and that's my dream to go there, you can see buildings that have Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew on them. It's really beautiful. It'd be wonderful to bring that back today.
Real quick, Karen, that motif on that rock, the poppies of course make sense, but that pot.
Is Mexican wedding pot. So here I have an Islamic arch, Islamic kind of formed arch that comes out of Islamic architecture. And there is no one Islamic art. There's many Islamic arts depending on the country. And when I talk about it, it's just, it's kind of an umbrella name, but there are different artworks and aesthetics to different countries, but I'm just talking about it generally. But it is an arch that comes out of the Islamic architecture, and I've put a Mexican wedding pot in there, again, because I'm wedding the designs of Azerbaijan with those of California. And I did find a lot of vegetation that was similar to California, like poppies. And on this piece here, this one, the Nagorno-Karabakh piece, and Layli's Secret, the rug over there with the calligraphic butterflies. I worked with a young woman who had moved to California. This is from 2000, these were made in 2007. And so Nauzar is from Iran, and she studied at the craft school, the arts and crafts school in Tehran. And I was introduced to her after she moved here, and she went to Otis. And she works as a designer today. She's still an artist. And I asked her if she'd be interested in doing some calligraphy for me. And so these calligraphic designs come out of specific literature, and the pieces are labeled with that. This one comes out of a poem from a famous Azeri poetess, and the poem is about her son that died. And I wanted to talk about losing a loved one, even though her son died of tuberculosis, not in this war or conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And the one over there alludes to a famous Iranian story or poem called Layli and Mejnun. It's a love story that some say influenced Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. I'm going to kind of hurry this up because I know we want to go over and work in clay. Here's my little tape, okay? These are my newest pieces here. I started this series called Objects of Memory in 2015. In June of 2015, my sister and I closed up my mother's condo because she moved into a retirement home. And so everything she had that we remembered growing up with, we had to get rid of. I kept a few things, my sister kept a few things, but everything else we gave away. Whoever went to the Jewish charity that day hit a gold mine. So we were packing everything up, and I was, of course, in charge of all the objects that were very fragile. My sister picks up a little blue cup goblet and says, I remember eating ice cream out of this as a child. And all of a sudden, this light bulb went up above my head, and I said, I want to document what it's like to close a life, to close all these memories that are, it's a sadness, it's very emotional, but yet I want to remember it in some manner. So I came up with this idea, and I'm still working on the last few pieces. I have many more pieces to this body of work. But these are the ones that I've had furniture made for me. Farnaz Sabet, my lab tech when I was teaching at USC, I collaborated with him, and he made this furniture per my design. And I decided to use porcelain but use no color, which is really a very different arena for me because all my work is so colorful. So anyway, this is supposed to be kind of ephemeral, and it's kind of to be thinking of you know, something that's ghostly or a memory that just kind of blurs through your memory. And this was the last piece I finished before the show. This was a lamp that was in our living room growing up. It was cloisonné, it was very colorful. And I believe it's in our attic. I haven't looked up there because I don't like to go up there. But anyway, it was my favorite piece that my parents had. And so I made it in sections, and it wasn't until the show that I got to hang it and see it installed. So I'm very excited about that. And yes?
Well, going through your pieces, you know, I can see definitely when you say I love the vessel form.
Yes.
And, you know, I'm looking at two-dimensional vessels and negative space vessels, etc. So I'd like to know, is there a common theme about, or a definition that you have about vessels? Because it's like a cabinet, a vessel, because it can hold things.
Or a human body as a container too.
So do you have something that is kind of common in your definition of vessel? I'd just be interested to know.
Yeah, they're containers. They're containers of ideas. They're containers of food and drink. They're containers of memories. So yeah, I mean, you're very astute to point that out. Like I said in the beginning, I started out making ceramic vessels, but many other things can be considered vessels. Like this furniture is a container of something. It's actually the original piece of furniture was a Chinese cabinet that held blankets or something. It was a very dark wood with brass decoration on it.
I have a question about this piece.
Yes.
You said it was from your childhood home. Do you know the cultural?
Yeah,
what
it comes
the-
from somewhere in the Islamic world again. You know, Persia maybe. It was a
The reason
lamp.
I'm asking, I just came from China, the Tibet portion
Yeah.
of China. I brought the fabric version. It looks just like the same shape.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's woven. And
Wow.
it's just exactly, it's amazing that it's like something they've been doing there obviously for centuries. So it's interesting that you had it in your childhood as a kind of home and object.
Yeah, my mother had a very good eye for things. She loved collecting things because she came from a very underprivileged background as an immigrant. Her parents were from Russia and very poor. So she really, when she married my father, you know, and had some, you know, money to spend on beautiful objects, she really did that. But there's so much trade and ideas that have been through the centuries. I went to the Sackler Museum, probably that's in Washington, D.C., 20 years ago and saw a show that talked about the first people that ferried in the sea in the area of Persia and China, and they were what is today Iraqian sailors, you know, and they traveled to China and had trained with China. And actually, the interesting story about the blue color, because the cobalt oxide comes from Persia, that part of the world. And so these Persian or Iraqi sailors, it wasn't Iraq in those days, sailed to China and they brought with them their blue color, and then they took back the porcelain with them. And then the Chinese took that blue color and started decorating with it. And then it was traded back to Persia. And then they started using it in their ceramics. And then it made it to Italy, you know. So it's really interesting, all these time. Do we need to move over to the...
We need to think about moving over.
Okay, let me just finish this room and then we'll go.
So I had a question.
That's okay, I understand.
Ceramics is a very rigid, kind of solid material, and yet you used it to try to communicate this ethereal, dreamlike world. And I think, as I look at them, the kind of the waviness of the forms and the kind of the less geometric lines and everything being a little softer around the edges. Did you have any ideas of how to try to get that dreamlike quality in such a really rigid material?
Great question. Yes, I did. That's why everything's hand-built. I didn't use the wheel at all. And you can see my fingerprints in it. So that was something intentional in the work.
Holding the lighting helps you, if you see the silhouette.
Right. And that was a conscious effort by Susanna and Michael to light it so that it would be a little bit in shadow, not bright spotlights on it. I would now like to talk about my piece, the Koblitz Embroidery Project. I began this piece in August of 2016. In 2014, on a visit to Prague, one of the sites that I went to was the Pinkas Synagogue in the Jewish Quarter, which is famous around the world, Prague's Jewish Quarter. And in the Pinkas Synagogue, they have painted upon the walls the names of the 77,000 Jews that were murdered in the Second World War. I found my family's surname over and over again in cities as big as Prague, smaller cities like Olomouc and Třebíč, and smaller villages like Vysoké Mýto and Brdachov. Brdachov is the town that my family comes from in southern Bohemia. And indeed, in doing research, these are members of my family that perished. I got the idea to create an embroidery because I was thinking about samplers that were made that talked about home sweet home. And I got to thinking, what is home? And these people were just dragged and yanked out of their homes. Their lives were disrupted and they were murdered only because they were Jewish. So I decided to do embroidery, and I did it upon a small tablecloth that was my mother's. And so all the people featured on this I've begun to do research on, and you will see that they have their name, their surname, their name, the date they were born, and the last known date they were on Earth. And in studying it, you realize, well, it's rather strange because you have groups, each star within it designates a family unit. And so you have a family unit of all people of all different ages, and they're all dying on the same day. Well, most likely that was the day that they arrived at Auschwitz or the other death camps where they perished. And so you have the youngest member, Robert, who is 11 years old. And then the oldest is Leopolda. She was 83 years old. Alfred Koblitz, I went to the archives in Prague last summer, and I was able to find information on many of the family from Prague. Alfred himself was a handsome young man. He was in his 20s. He was a jockey. He trained horses. He drove cars. He had applied to immigrate to the Dominican Republic to get out of Czechoslovakia, but it was denied, and he perished in Auschwitz. There are 3 sisters here, Marketa, Anna, and Ottilie, that lived together. They were in their 30s, and they worked at various businesses. Ottilie was an administrative assistant to someone. And Ottilie herself, I found records about her being arrested because she had a radio in her possession, and Jews were not allowed to have radios, so she had a police record for that. All 3 sisters, they had tried through a program of taking Jews out and saving them to go to London to work. That sadly didn't happen. And then they had applied, as most of my family from Prague had applied, to go to Shanghai. There was a huge Jewish population in Shanghai during the Second World War. It was one of the only places in the world that accepted Jews to help them to save their lives. The eldest member, Leopolda, had gone to the bank. There was a police record on her because she had gone to the bank. It was in November, and it was cold, obviously, and she had her hands in a muff to keep them warm. And she went up to the entrance and asked the gentleman at the entrance what day Jews were allowed to enter the bank. And he noticed that her muff was covering the Jewish star that all Jews, the yellow star that they were required to wear. So he called the police, and she was arrested, and they were asking a lot of money to release her. And within 2 months, she was murdered in a concentration camp. So I want to finish just with a few more pieces, then we'll run over to the sculpture studio. This one here was inspired by my first visit to Azerbaijan. It's called 47 Vessels from Sheki. And when I was in Sheki, I met this wonderful archaeologist, Nasib Mukhtarov. And he invited us into his museum that he made himself, an old building that the wind was whipping through. There was no electricity in it. You had to only be there in the day. And he had been excavating these incredible pieces that were historic from that part of the world. And what interests me in his little museum was this setup like this of vessels that were on the floor. And I asked him about it, and he said, oh, this was set up for a funeral. And I found this burial out in the countryside near here, and I brought it back and I set it up as I found it. And so I wrote a grant, and I came back to work again in Azerbaijan, and I went with him to the sites that he was excavating. And so at this point, these are thrown on the wheel, and I hadn't done sawdust firing, and after this I started to do sawdust firing So I tried to emulate the sawdust firing with spraying underglazes with an airbrush onto the pieces. And so at a burial, the body would be here and people would come with food and drink in some of the vessels to feast at the death. And others would, other vessels that contained food and drink were for the afterlife. And so I filled my vessels with, the powdery substance there is madder root. Madder root is a natural dye, and it's used in Azerbaijan, which has a very big industry of carpet weaving. And it was used to weave carpets, to dye the wool red in their weaving of carpets. So the other thing I liked about it was there's a town called Kuba in the mountains that is famous for weaving. And across the river is a Jewish settlement, and the Jews came up from Persia centuries ago to escape persecution. And the Azeris have always been very, very, they've really allowed the Jews to live there in peace, and they take care of them. And the Jews have fought with them against the Armenians, and it's weird to go there and hear the Jewish community say, we like Muslims, we don't like Christians. You know, it's really strange to see this alliance between though Jews and Muslims are cousins. So anyway, I got some madder root and I used it here. And in the Jewish settlement of Krasna Slobida across the river from Kuba, the Jews used to grow madder root for the carpet making. And then Azerbaijan is also famous for oil, and so some of the vessels have oil in them, motor oil. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about these three pieces, then we'll go and get going in clay. These two pieces here come from my second visit to Azerbaijan, and going back to the museum in Shaki. And I noticed that he had a book of drawings, and the drawings related to certain pots. So he had some kind of anthropologist came in and took the designs that were flat and flattened them off the three-dimensional pot. And I thought that was marvelous. So I made my own vessels and designs, and then I flattened them. This piece here again pays homage to Abalova Ganira, because this is called Abalova Swallow. Inshallah, God willing, she comes to America one day. These are actually sawdust fired. So I made the pots, I burnished them, I put slip on them and burnished them. And so this, it's called Tattoo Series because myself, my niece, my sister, all of us have tattoos, my daughter. And so I took the tattoos on all our bodies and made pieces out of, decorated the pots with family tattoos. That's my niece, Nora. She has these 3 tattoos. She has more now. And since I have tattoos, my daughter has tattoos. You know, I can't tell her no. So anyway.
That's her tattoo? Is that the Venus of Willendorf?
It's interesting.
Or a vagina?
Okay, very good. So our CV is Red Creek Valley, and it's upside down on her foot, so that when you're standing in front of her and you look at it, it's upside down, but to her it's right side up. And it's a camp she used to go to as a child, and she was a counselor many years in Durango, Colorado. Beneath it is actually like Georgia O'Keeffe's skull. It's upside down.
Oh, I see it now. It looks
And
like
then-
the Venus of Willendorf.
Right, it does look like it. I know, it does look like it. I like that. No one's ever said that before, but it does. Good eye. And then the other 2 decorations on either side of the skull are designs that she has also together. They're all separate. They're 3 separate tattoos. And in 2010, I went to Israel for the second time. I have family there, but I was invited to be the keynote speaker at a symposium in El Faham, which is the largest Arab city in Israel. And there's an art gallery there, and it shows really famous people like Yoko Ono and famous artists from the Arab world. He also, Abu Shakra Said, opened the first Museum of Contemporary Art for Arab artists in Israel. So I went there, and at the symposium, here I was, Jewish American. I brought along with me a friend who is Turkish Muslim. She lives in America now and teaches art history. And then I brought 3 artists from Azerbaijan, and then there were artists that were Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians, and Druze. And we all worked together. It was a wonderful experience. And so this piece came from the idea that there's this horrible conflict that's just never ending. And the idea of a tear bottle, which is also in that carpet over there, is something comes from Roman times, where people would cry into a bottle, and their tears would mark their mourning and their sadness. And so a shape of a single bottle like this, with a tear, kind of an eye shape at the top, is a Persian tear bottle shape. So I made 2 tear bottles, and I put them together for both the Palestinians and the Jews, who call Israel here their homeland. And the tears are flooding through the bottles into the country. And then I decided to sort of put it in a house shape, which really, it's not the real historic shape of houses in that part of the world, but to us, we know it as the shape of a house. Put it on its side so it could be, and texture it like cobblestone streets or stone walls.
Picking up on a lot of kind of surrealistic shapes in the Homeland piece, and I just wanted to know if that was intentional or not.
Well, it's like a figure. I mean, it looks like a woman's figure with the buttocks and the legs in the air, yes.
The patterning and all that other stuff, it's just got a very almost Dali-esque kind of feel to it. I just wanted to know if that was accidental or if you had kind of thought about that while working on it.
Well, as I joined them together, I definitely realized it's very figural, you know? So that came out of making it, and I did realize that, but I didn't realize when I always do drawings, and I always had my students do drawings. Drawings are a starting point, so when I'm talking to them, I know where their brain is at, and drawings are a starting point, and as you work, they can be discarded. But they are a good point to start at, and that's what I did with all of this work. I drew it first, and then it goes through changes as I make it. So shall we go over and start working in clay, because I know everyone's anxious. Thank you for letting me go a little longer. My love for Italy is endless. My junior year of college, I was fortunate enough to study in Florence. I studied art history, I did a little bit of art, learned this beautiful language. And then in 1989, I was invited by Ubaldo Grazia to go to Deruta, Italy, which has a history of ceramic production since the Renaissance. And I spent from 89 to 2003 making trips to this ceramic center in Umbria, designing dinnerware and other shapes. And on one of my first trips, I learned about Santa Caterina here. She is the patron saint of Deruta. Here is a panoramic of Deruta. And she was selected in the early 20th century to represent the potters in this town because she was martyred on a wheel and potters throw on the wheel. And I just thought that was such a wonderful story. It's so deliciously Catholic. And so here she is on a beautiful Umbrian vase, the Deruta dragon, and the handles come from Orvieto. And then around the base, I have put different designs. Some of them are my original designs, like this Matisse vase here, or this green leaf pattern dinnerware. Other ones are this is also one of mine. Other ones are designs that are traditional to the Grazia factory and Deruta in general.